Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Professor, Greg Dooley, and the pundit, Steve Clark. Men, take the mic.
It's the Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark, and we're proudly presented by Nick Hopwood, who's a certified financial planner, founder, and president of Peak Wealth Management. Retire with peak confidence. We highly recommend going to Nick's website at peakwm.com. Michigan's football future is looking brighter. I'll explain. Walk-ons getting the pink slip, and the Professor is going to Bloomington. But first, Michigan falls to Oregon. Number one ranked Oregon, 38-17. And it was just another downer for the Michigan faithful.
And we got to talk about really the first touchdown, because a lot of people are talking about it this morning.
Controversial touchdown. Shouldn't have been a touchdown for Oregon's opening TV. The receiver may have lost the ball on the turf.
Just to be clear, he 100% dropped it, went off his arms, the nose of the football. It didn't hit a magical new piece of equipment that Nike created. It bounced up. It was right in front of the line judge. Don't know why he missed it. I could see maybe he thought it went under his elbow or something. Doesn't matter. But this was a first, Steve. I assume you got this. We got an audio recording from U of M Media Relations last night of who I believe was the head referee, the white hat, as if you will, explaining. And basically it's him explaining right after the game. And what happens is every score is reviewed, as everybody knows now, right? Every scoring play is reviewed. And the refs on the field, they look to the replay referee for a thumbs up. And the thumbs up meaning it's good. They looked at it, you can kick the extra point. They got the thumbs up, they kicked the extra point, and then, of course, CBS shortly thereafter starts playing the full replay of the angle of the ball hitting the ground. And Gary Danielson's like, well, and, of course, Twitter's like, what? And, so I'll say this, we're leading with this. So there's someone listening to this going, okay, here's whiny Michigan fan, and that's not me. This was the first touchdown of the game, so we're talking about it in sequence, not because of the significance. But I do have a big problem with it, not because it would have changed the outcome of the game. It's a colossal failure in the process that we're supposed to rely on. That's something that's pretty easy to do, is to check these things. And this wasn't close. It bounced right off the turf. So that's my frustration, but do not mistake that with Michigan got screwed and we would have won the game, or it would have significantly changed the game, because I'm not there, Steve. I don't know if you are.
Completely agree with you.
Yeah.
At best, it would have made it a field goal instead of a touchdown. The process, if every scoring play is reviewed, we don't hear very often where they really screwed it up. So this was hopefully just a one-off in all of that. But yes, all the cameras are supposed to be there available at their disposal, and they missed it. So Oregon was not going to lose this football game in Michigan Stadium. Michigan, though, did some things to take advantage on special teams. They had a forced fumble by Joe Taylor, recovered by C.J. Charleston, two guys I've never mentioned on this podcast before. Got the fumble recovery.
I think we did bring up Joe Taylor because he's made up some great plays and he happens to be a favorite student of mine, Steve. So.
But did we ever talk about their names on the podcast before?
I swear. We'll have to go back. We'll have to check.
You go ahead and do that.
Yeah. Not C.J. Charleston for sure, but I thought we did talk about Joe Taylor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, people, if you are dedicated listeners to this podcast, go ahead and do the research for Greg, because Greg doesn't want to do it, and I'm certainly not going to do it. But if you want to chime in and say the Professor is right, feel free to do so in the comment section. What did we have here? We had Davis Warren to Tyler Morris to tie it at 7. And then coming out of halftime hasn't exactly been Michigan's strength. But the defense held Oregon to a 3-and-out to start the third quarter, and then Davis Warren fires a TD pass in traffic, by the way, to Peyton O'Leary for his second career touchdown reception. These are building blocks if you want to choose to be optimistic on this one. But a crucial moment after that, Greg, was the Wolverines get a hold. I think Oregon got one first down. Michigan was seizing momentum. Oregon was set to punt, and then Michigan lined up in the neutral zone to give Oregon a fresh set of downs. You don't see that very often in the game. Michigan also had 12 men on the field on the same possession. That led to a field goal and drained 4 minutes off the clock.
No, there was a lot of eye rolling, arms up in the air, and a lot of the post-game chatter was about the coaches. And, they got to put the players in the best position to win, and they got to coach that up. And you don't see that very often, especially in a punt. That was a killer. That was a killer.
And if that wasn't enough about the coaching questions in this one, Michigan's last chance to make it interesting, they go for it on 4th down inside the red zone for a trick play that, hey, they all worked last week. But Alex Orji was covered coming out of the backfield, and the play became DOA at that point. Samaj Morgan, the last guy you would expect to be throwing the ball, threw it anyway because he just figured, I'm not going to get the 5 yards just running it, so I better throw it up in the air.
He sure did. He sure did. He threw it, Steve, 30 yards up into the student section. I think he had a little adrenaline rush there, my man.
That's what
he threw
happens.
it tight spiral.
It's what happens.
Yeah, and he winged it. I got to give Oregon credit. If you watch the replay, the guy was waiting and just watching Orji and just waiting for him to release, and he sure did, and he was all over it. The play blew up.
And if Samaj Morgan hits the pass, it's again a second straight week of great quarterback coaching, play calling, but it didn't, and so now we criticize it times 2.
We do, and you got to think, it just seemed that everything worked against MSU, so you knew they were going to probably mix in some cute stuff. My issue with it, and again, hindsight is 2020, but Warren was really rolling. Keep the ball in his hands and see if he can cook, man, because he was cooking. He really was.
Well, Davis Warren probably had his best passing game of the year.
Well,
it was
he
his
did.
first multi-touchdown game. He had season best in efficiency and QBR ratings, and he didn't turn the ball over.
No, and what happened was something was going on in the CBS telecast, and I know when a team is down, they look for storylines and things like that. But the other storyline, other than Oregon, was Warren, and it started to build up, and he started to throw some of these throws. And Steve, they weren't like gutty good throws. Some of these were NFL throws, and Danielson and the broadcast crew really got behind him, and they should have. It was really a good thing. And so if there's a bright side out of this is, where might Davis Warren go, and might we have that signature win here in the end of the season? It's something I'm excited to watch. I want to see how he performs in Bloomington. But he absolutely did, and he helped make it interesting, where a position that we thought was completely lost, I do take this as a bright moment out of the game, is his gutty performance.
I'm not as optimistic as you are. Michigan's got a lot more to improve on, just the quarterback issue. And Indiana is a powerhouse. So, yeah, did they make it interesting? I guess so. Are you calling it a moral victory?
No, not quite. Moral victory was in play, by the way. And I talked to a few people before the game. Like, there was a moral victory outcome of this. I don't think we got it. But they did hang in there. And we did have 2 starting DBs down. And again, this part of our show is we are trying to look for the bright side here. Loveland was absolutely a star. The other storyline from Michigan's side was absolutely Loveland and just his performance. And he made one catch so incredible, Steve, that Sharon burned a timeout, hoping to convince the refs that it was a catch.
Yeah.
He clearly lost it, though, and trying to make it so doesn't make it so. I got a few texts from people going, why are we doing this?
We were wondering the same thing in the press box because it was clear he didn't complete the process. But this is what Sharon had to say afterwards, after the game was over. Essentially, Sharon was fighting for his players. His players all thought it was going to be a catch and it was going to be a good to go. So as a head coach, if you want the players to continue to fight for you and the team and the program and the Block M when things aren't going your way or you're playing an opponent that's ranked in the top 10, then the coaches better fight for the players who think this is worth fighting for. A lot of the players thought the catch was going to be good. Yeah, they lose a timeout in which a game they're losing by 20-some points. Why don't you just support the players in this one? And if you come out a loser, at least you know the coach fought for you, the player, in the moment. So I thought it was a good move to go ahead and burn that timeout, even though you weren't going to win the argument.
I disagree there, Steve. We just threw a timeout in the garbage. I think there's other ways to support your players. And by the way, I don't think Sharon has any deficit with his locker room on supporting them in there. But I understand.
Well, I think that's just something you keep up, and so he was going to do that.
I'll tell you, he caught the ball every way you can catch the ball, except for completing the process. Like, he had it, he went over, he twisted, he got to the ground just barely, and the ball popped out. That's the rule.
Until Calvin Johnson came around, we always thought that was going to be good enough to be a catch sometime around. But I think a lot of Michigan fans are a little bit miffed about how Oregon got to a 28-7 lead at halftime and how explosive they were. And I just got to tell you, this is what Oregon does to everybody. You look at the week prior, they had 35 first-half points against Illinois. They scored touchdowns on their first 3 possessions 2 weeks ago at Purdue. They had 22 points in the first half at home against Ohio State and had 357 yards of total offense in the first half on MSU. Those are the previous 4 games that Oregon has played. So the Wolverines, Michigan was kind of competitive in the first half, and then Oregon got 2 quick touchdowns late in the second quarter to make it a little bit worse than it should. But this is what Oregon does to everybody. So I'm not too mad about, Michigan's first half deficit in that.
Yeah, I'm not either. Steve, we did see Alex Orji pass the ball, which you liked.
Out of the Wildcat.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just my thing. Maybe it's one of those things that I only care about. But every time that Alex Orji came in for a Wildcat package, he's supposed to be a quarterback who can throw the ball to make it more dynamic. And up until then, he wasn't really doing that. It was incomplete, but at least they showed the will to actually attempt it.
It might happen. They might keep a safety or a linebacker or somebody honest. We'll see. Another positive, Steve, no one listens to this podcast for recruiting updates. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
Okay, but something is happening with the players, with the relationships. Sharon is personally making relationships with recruits, and apparently it's working. So far, there's been some flips. We're not going to get into all that. And yes, those of you who are pining for a superstar high school quarterback, Bryce Underwood, a local kid here who's committed to LSU, he's in play from everything we hear from our friend Sam Webb. Don't know if it's going to happen, but there are good things happening there. What else, Steve?
Well, we endorse going to the Michigan Insider for all these recruiting updates and everything that Sam and Ira do. It's a fabulous place to go to for the nitty-gritty and the details. The Wolverines are challenging for Bryce. It's a tough challenge. I think that their NIL recruitment pitch is probably going to be stronger than LSU's, and it needs to be because LSU has a lot of things going for them as well. The decision is his. There's a top-notch receiver who appears to be going wherever Bryce goes. But I'm excited about the last couple of weeks that Michigan isn't going to be starting over again like the Rich Rod or Brady Hoke years. They are trying to do a one-off, might be a two-off, but they're bringing in top-notch recruits. Andrew Babalola is an offensive tackle, probably the highest-rated offensive line recruit Michigan has ever had since ranking and rankings began 30 or 40 years ago. Michigan is loading up at cornerback right now. A lot of people critiquing about how the secondary is playing. They've already got 2 guys ranked in the top 100 of overall players, regardless of position. They just happen to be corner. Another one is just outside that ranking, and plus there's another 4-star who may have already signaled where he's going. We record these podcasts on Sunday, and news could break as early as Sunday evening or even Monday morning about that.
Yeah, so good stuff there. And, Steve, there will be some changes to the coaching staff. You can bet on it. Sharon Moore didn't have a lot of time to get his coaching staff together. He's going to make some changes to it, and I think you're going to see some more changes as we move along here. That's for the future. We still got some work to do. There are some more downsides, Steve, though. Oregon scores a late touchdown. Were they piling on? We can't say that. We can't sit here at Michigan and say that. Harbaugh, was known to score a few late touchdowns. If you don't like it, you got to stop them. And here's the other thing. The fact is, Oregon knows there's going to be a dance here at the end of the season to say who's slotted where. Michigan has all these common opponents, including Texas, which makes it unique, not just the Big Ten, where they're going to be discussing how they did against Michigan. It's going to be something that's going to be presented up there. So I don't blame them for that late touchdown, do you?
No, not at all. You make great points, and I've gotten over the fact about people kneeling when they should.
Get over it. Yeah, seriously. Speaking of who that top team is, so talk about turning the page. So they flashed on game day, on ESPN's game day, all the potential playoff teams, all of them up on a board. And, of course, Michigan wasn't on there. But who other than Nick Saban goes, well, hey, I know we're talking about 1 and 2 lost teams. He goes, but if Michigan wins the rest of their schedule, including Oregon, of course, how are you going to say they're not in there? And he's right. If we would have somehow beat Oregon and went on to beat the teams that we have ahead of us, Indiana and Ohio State, yeah, Michigan would have been probably solid, at least in the conversation for the playoff. So, yeah, that last gasp of any hope that somebody out there had, that somehow we pulled it all together, we got it going against MSU, and we were going to do it against Oregon, That flame has now been extinguished. We are now talking about, are we going to make a bowl or not? And of course, recruiting, and we're all looking toward next year. So that hope is over.
Yeah,
but Nick Saban, of all people, came up and said, hey, wait a minute.
I know. Fine. That conversation would have put them in the 5 to 14% category. Michigan has got 2 teams that could be ranked in the top 10 when they play them the rest of the regular season. What will those wins do? Claps and attaboys, and again, another visible sign that things are turning sooner than what many people expected.
Absolutely. Fans are squarely aimed at the coaches right now. Mood-wise, we're in the 60s. We're right on the brink of what we call Ann Arbor torch and pitchfork time, Steve. People are upset, but hey, it's been rough. It's a rough ride.
When do Michigan fans just accept the fact that you're going to be beaten by a top 10 team? They're a top 10 for a reason. Michigan clearly isn't. And why don't you measure progress within that context?
Nope. You're welcome to Michigan fandom, Steve. It's not going to happen. One sight and sound, I noticed that Brian Griese, of course, quarterback of the 97 national champions, visited and was announced to the crowd. He got a big roar. I don't think it's any surprise that we haven't seen Brian Griese on the field in recent years, Steve. He was part of the anti-Harbaugh group clan. He was very vocal when things were bad. That group kind of quieted down as we started to win championships.
You don't say.
As you might imagine. Yep. But I don't think their disdain for Harbaugh went away at all during that time. Now,
it's too bad. We don't need factions.
Well, we have them.
Yes, but we don't need them.
Even in the face of a national championship run, we have factions.
Perfect.
So I'm not sure they ever flipped. It's a group of Lloyd Carr guys. I'm not knocking them, Steve. I'm just saying they're out there. So if you're like, where's he been? I think that's where he's been. I can't speak for Brian Griese, but I think that's where he's been. And he was back, and he got a big roar, as he should have.
Good.
Yeah.
He's a national championship quarterback. It was a wonderful era of Michigan football. When I look back at Oregon, that reminds me of Gary Muller's offense. It's one of the top offensive lines in the country. It's one of the best quarterbacks in the country with a strong receiving group that loves to block downfield and a solid running game. That is Oregon.
Yeah.
That is Oregon's offense. Couldn't feel horrible. It just made me a little bit nostalgic for what they did. And Oregon, by the way, did it without Tez Johnson most of the game. Their number 1 receiver.
Boy.
One of the top 2 receivers in the Big Ten. He was out, and Oregon just kept moving the ball anyway. Evan Stewart, their second guy, became the number 1 guy and was all over the field.
Yeah, and Gabriel, we didn't talk about him, played a great game. And the receivers they had just made some fantastic catches, including one that got called back but is being played on ESPN all weekend for the beautiful one-handed catch and dive he made. Steve, I mentioned Brian Griese. I believe when he started his career, he was a walk-on, Steve. Mm-hmm. He was a walk-on. And you want to talk a little bit about the House settlement because people like walk-ons and roster limits and scholarships, it's really changing, and it will be a big deal. So
last couple of weeks, people are starting to feel the side effects of what's been going on and what we're leaning towards in the season of 2025, 2026. Scholarships are increasing, but roster spots are actually decreasing. And some of the walk-ons are getting their notice already about how they're not going to be welcome back to the team either this year or next year. In a nutshell, what it did was the NCAA said, as part of the settlement, they agreed to set roster limits for every team. The football team will be at 105, and also said you can give scholarships to everybody. Okay, so for teams like basketball, men's basketball, and football, that means everyone on the roster now is going to get a scholarship. But the roster's limited, whereas in football, they have about 136 to 137 guys that are in Schembechler Hall right now. That will be restricted to 105. Okay, so for that team, it's going to be a big deal. And they've got 20 to 25 recruits coming in. So that's why you have a guy, Steve, like Sean McGee, who's the general manager. He's got to manage the roster and figure this out. It's not just football. Okay, there are extra walk-on people on most of the teams on campus. And by the way, you think they're paying attention to this? They absolutely are. And it wasn't just recently. It was this summer. Guys are like, if they're planning on being around next year, they were working a little harder to get the attention of the coaching staff. It's not just so that maybe they'll get a scholarship, because maybe on the wrestling team they're not going to get a scholarship. But they can't be in the room anymore, okay, because you can't have anyone outside this roster. And basically what the NCAA allowed was a few extra guys, right? You could be there, ladies, on these teams.
So there are probably a good 100+ athletes at Michigan who are competing right now in varsity teams who won't be able to next year. It's a big deal. It's on the mind of a lot of people. I had Ward Manuel in to speak to history of college athletics this past week. He was great. We had about an hour conversation about all this stuff, and he made a good point and was something he's concerned about. He said they should have phased this in. They should have said, well, let's just take football. It's 130, 140 guys now. How about next year it's 120, then maybe 110, and then 105. So you can at least help walk this back a little bit over time and protect the people who are assuming they were going to be varsity athletes for the next few years. And then you have the cases like the Brian Greaseys, I believe maybe the Joe Taylors, we'll mention them again. And then the guys like Bredesen, who's our captain right now, who maybe they earn a scholarship later on. They're not going to get that chance. And it is a concern. It is a concern right now.
I look at the football, and I think Brian Greasy would have been one of the 105. Maybe he'll tell you differently. I've never seen more than 105 players participate in a single game, even in the biggest of blowouts, when it's 66-3 or 58-0. How many people actually got onto the field? And I don't know what it's like for every team across the, maybe all 130 people play. But I just noticed that from Michigan, when you see a blowout, I start counting the numbers. How many people actually did participate in this game?
So what Ward has said is a couple things. He is not going to drop the existing scholarships on teams. That's important because other schools, including Ohio State, have already said for this program, we're getting rid of our scholarships. So Michigan's going to keep at least the number of scholarships for each team. Then Ward has said, hey, Michigan, if you want us to fund the rest, all of the new ones, it's going to be another $30 million where we need to find revenue. So he's hinted at he's open to the idea, but he's also said we don't have that $30 million unless we raise it. So what I've heard already is that they've went out and said, okay, we're going to increase our overall number of scholarships by a little bit at first, and we're going to figure out a way to fund that. But they haven't said we've figured out a way to get that $30 million gap. So he's told some of the coaches, my understanding, my hunch, if you will, that, hey, you used to have 10 scholarships, you're going to have 13 next year. He's said that, but it's not the full roster, just to be clear.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, does it need to be bigger than the people that are actually going to participate playing in a game?
Great question. For football, absolutely. I think 105 is probably more than will participate in the game.
Like when you look at volleyball, there's 18 people on a roster.
Yeah.
Do you really expect 18 people to play in any given game?
No, and then it comes down to, do we need 18 scholarships to attract the talent to have them to compete? And I think the answer is probably no. The question is, what do we need to fill out our roster to compete at the level we expect to compete, which I assume is a league plus better championship level. Do we need 18 scholarships to compete? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think we need, even against the Oklahomas of the world, I don't think we need a full 20-some-odd scholarships on softball to compete at the highest level. I think we need more than we had. So that's the conversation I think that's going on right now. What about swim and dive? And then you've got the Indianas of the world that probably are going to give more scholarships to their swim and dive team because it's iconic. Mark Spitz, their coach is the Olympic coach.
Or Oregon with track and field.
Oregon track and field. Great. Perfect example. Are we competing with Oregon or are we competing with something else? I think the answer is it's probably something else. And then you try to right-size the scholarship limits. But I don't have the answers to all these questions, Steve. These are all the things, and the coaches are negotiating. They're doing all that. But someone like Bev Plotke, who's the all-time winningest coach in any sport in Big Ten champions, she probably gets a say to say, look, I'm competing with the SEC, Livy Dunn, and LSU, and all those schools. I need more scholarships. And Ward probably said, you got it, Bev. Here's a few more. And Bonnie Thole from the softball team probably did the same thing. And by the way, Sean Bourmet has finished top 6 in the NCAAs the last 6 years in wrestling, which is brutal, and sent all kinds of people to the Olympics. I'm guessing he had a good argument when he said, I need more scholarships. That's what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the next thing in the future is while every school has different sense of worth about certain varsity teams that are to their school, I think one of the next points of conversation is inequity within the conference of whose pet program is over the rest of the conference that's going to look like, well, it's these two schools that are always going to fight it because they're the only two schools that are going to give X amount of scholarships to that program, and everybody else is fighting for crumbs.
No, you're right. You're spot on. Indiana soccer, they care about they have an iconic soccer program as well. They care about that. You mentioned Oregon track. We compete against Johns Hopkins. They're an affiliate member in lacrosse. That's their Super Bowl. It's lacrosse. Right. That's it. So they're probably going to fund all those scholarships. So now Kevin Connery probably didn't get a ton more scholarships, even though they won back-to-back Big Ten championships. Okay.
John Hopkins wins every Big Ten title for the next 10 years.
Well, that's the example. So then you're like, well, Dooley, what about NIL? NIL's still in play. John Hopkins probably has NIL. It's on top of all this. This is separate. The last thing, someone asked me about this, what about endowed scholarships? Where does that fit in? And you got to separate that for a second. So I'll use our swim team. I believe we have endowed scholarships for our swim team. So where I believe the endowed scholarship, and what's an endowed scholarship? That is someone giving a few $1 million so that in perpetuity, whatever the cost of a scholarship in, that money's invested, in each year it covers the cost of a scholarship. That's what an endowment is, right? It's a lot of money that will earn. Nick can tell you about it. They probably use a standard like 3 or 3.5% rate of growth or something like that, and it funds a scholarship. Okay, but that is just money that's donated to the greater athletic department. But symbolically, it says to the swim coach, one of mine is covered, okay? So I would like to know, did the swim coach go in Ward's office and go, hey, you can't cut my scholarships, man. You can't cut them. They're endowed. Or these 7 scholarships have been donated by somebody, some in the 70s, some in the 80s, a few years ago. You can't take them away. You already have my money. And to me, that's a fair argument. And I wonder if that played into we're not cutting any because they didn't want to get messy with the endowed scholarships.
If the endowed scholarships are paying for itself, why would you get rid of them?
I know, but it was money that just went into the athletic director coffers. So it's really about the athletic department honoring that commitment that someone made back in time. When I made this commitment, it was a promise that this scholarship will be funded indefinitely. Mm-hmm. That was the promise. Now, if we get rid of scholarships and all that, but we haven't, maybe the conversation changes. But if my family donated something like that, I would expect it to be there.
I would too.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, there's a lot there. But from what I'm hearing is they are positioning and here's the other thing. The coaches need to know now. Why? Because I'll just use the example of wrestling. They are recruiting for next year. Mm-hmm. They need to know how many scholarships they have to offer. Here's one thing, and I may have said this, and I may have said it wrong or it changed, one or the other, but they can break up the scholarships. I don't know if they can for football, but wrestling traditionally, you get a quarter scholarship and we'll make up the rest some way else, or we'll help you out, or you'll get some financial aid. You can break up these scholarships. So
that won't change.
Yeah, so you can give someone a partial scholarship. It's not a head count, was what they call it, where a scholarship has to be 100%. Sure. No, they can split it up. So the volleyball team, if they got more scholarships, could theoretically spread those out amongst the whole roster.
And the other aspect of all of this is that for every dollar that you are giving to the wrestling program or the cross-country program or the tennis program, not to narrow these people specifically, is one less dollar that the football and basketball programs are getting.
In theory, yep, you got it.
And when it comes down to the competition, once again, programs get a little bit nervous when they realize that their rival program counterparts are spending a little bit more money than they are. That means it's halftime on The Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark. And our sponsor, Nick Hopwood from Peak Wealth Management, has been sitting in the bullpen.
One of your favorite tools is the HSA, the health savings account. And I know this is another thing that you promote, tweet, encourage. Tell us really in a nutshell why you really encourage people to consider this.
It's because of the triple tax-free benefit. And I honestly, as much as I love Roth, HSAs I love even more. People don't know about the HSA. People are not taking advantage of it. They're using it the wrong way. And it's a real opportunity cost.
We've had plenty of medical expenses and things like that, but I haven't touched my HSA. I'm kind of just letting it grow.
Perfect.
Because I know it's coming, but why wouldn't I just let it grow? Maybe if I don't need it right now.
What are you doing with those medical receipts?
Hanging on to them.
Excellent.
Based on your advice, by the way. Tell Steve why.
All right, Steve. So here's what a lot of people do when they're misutilizing their HSA. You go to the doctor, you have a copay or whatever, or you have the full expense. You need to pay that out of pocket. A lot of people, instead, they use the HSA money because it's there. And it makes you feel good to say, well, I saved and now I'm using the money. But then you're not able to take advantage of that middle part, which is where it can grow. You're not getting that tax deferral. So we want to pay for our expenses out of pocket and invest the HSA, let it grow. But keep that receipt, Duels, because you're going to be able to match that up with a withdrawal in 30 years.
Okay, so you can basically say, hey, I had a $300 medical expense back in 2023. Now it's 20 years later, and you could say that's justification for taking that amount down.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
I had no idea. I thought it had to be done within the same calendar year. Not so, huh?
Not so. Back to that education piece, right? You guys are educating your fans. They're craving this information and you're delivering.
So if you have a question or want to know more from Nick Hopwood, go to peakwm.com or call 734-681-7575. That's 734-681-7575 or simply peakwm.com.
All right, so Steve, get this. Speaking of people on the brink of what's being shaken up, one of the big questions is revenue sharing and who's getting what portion of the revenue sharing. There is no formula.
We were just alluding to that going into halftime.
There was no formula given. There was a suggestion given by the Big Ten. I don't want to get into it, but the problem is not everyone has a hockey program. We certainly do. And the head man of the hockey program, Brandon Arado, was a guest in my leadership class for the first time. Fascinating stuff. He came in last week, and I got to mention them because it was on the heels of a big trip to play Boston University, number 5 Boston University, at kind of an iconic, historic hockey power. Most of you know that. And Steve, Michigan swept, won 5-1, I believe, on Friday, and then on Saturday, won in overtime 5-4. That is a big deal for the future. If you know how the NCAA hockey is basically a formula after the conference champions, and to get 2 wins over a Hockey East team is a big deal.
It is a big deal.
Yep. I'm going to tell you guys to keep an eye on Michigan hoops.
Men's or women's?
Women's hoops. That they have these 2 superstars, and Syla Swords, who played in Paris as a 17-year-old for the Canadian Olympic team, and Olivia Olson, who's a 5-star recruit from Minnesota. This is probably post-pod release, but they play number 1 South Carolina and the defending champions on Monday of this week, and they're probably not going to win that game. But these guys are going to, it's out in Las Vegas. They're going to learn a lot. And speaking of Swords and Olson, Steve, a little birdie told me that our own Nick Hopwood might have booked the dynamic duo Frosh on his podcast coming up. Can you believe it?
I don't.
Yeah, it's going to be wild.
No offense to Nick. I just, that surprises me.
Yeah, so look for that from Nick. We'll see if that works out. But that's what, you heard it here first. I am heading to Bloomington, Steve, as you mentioned in the head of the show. I'm excited. My son is in Bloomington. I got my MBA in 2 years in Bloomington. Happen to love the place. Ann Arbor's home. But if there was a second place that I'd love to live and hang out, I love that town. I love the vibe. And I remember when I dropped my son off, the joke was, hey, your dad will probably be back to watch Michigan destroy Indiana. And everyone had a big laugh, Steve. Everyone had a big laugh. And now I'm certain that Michigan will be double-digit underdogs going into Bloomington, at least.
Michigan is opened up as an 11.5-point underdog.
There you go. I am going to hit Yanko's Little Zagreb. If you know, you know, Steve. It's their iconic steakhouse. It's no frills. You have a checkered tablecloth. You get a baked potato and some coleslaw. They churn and burn you, Steve. They have Yingling. Steve, okay. It's in Indiana. They have Yingling beer. But the steaks are amazing. It's kind of the spot. If you're an opposing coach, it's kind of the spot you go. And it'll be packed on Friday night. I got the reservation 5 months ago.
Nice. So when they say churn and burn, I mean, they seat you and they want you out. Like it's one of those places that you get the bill as your main meal is being handed to you. It's like, look underneath your plate. Your bill is right underneath. You know?
Right. No, you're going in, put the fork to bite the steak, and it stabs the bill as it's jammed, in between your fingers. I love it. It's a great place. I've heard all kinds of stories of football coaches going in there and like ordering the double porterhouse. But it'll be fun. If you are down there, look for me. I know we have some listeners who make many road trips. Let's try to connect. It's a 3:30 kick, Steve, and hopefully the good weather will keep up.
Well, 6 hours south, so.
Indiana's, I was going to say, the 6 hours, you wouldn't think it, but it's southern enough Indiana where the climate is a little different than it is up
You
here.
get about maybe 5 to 10 degrees warmer on certain days, and on certain days it can be 25 degrees warmer. One of the ways that I know I'm in a churn and burn is when a waitress takes your drink and food order at the same time.
Yes. No, I don't mind it.
It's just like, let's get this all taken care of up front. The third thing is when people have their automatic card readers, they have that in their hand looking at you in the face. Is there anything more that I can do for you today?
Possibly, yes.
And if the answer is no, the bill electronic holder is being passed on to you to put your card in. And that is definitely a way to make you not feel welcome anymore.
Yeah, there is no push cart with the selection of desserts, where it's slowly, would you like us to put on a fresh pot of coffee is a question that's never been asked in Yonkos. So, but Indiana's coming in on a high, Steve. They were down early to state.
First time all season they trailed.
That's right. First time, this guy, Signetti, man. And then they crushed them, 47 straight points.
Jeez.
And just roared. Their quarterback came back, Steve, from thumb surgery.
Yeah, Curtis Rourke.
He didn't seem to have any problems. So Aiden Childs was forced out of the game. Indiana had 7 sacks, Steve, 15 tackles for loss. They're making plays all over the field. God, just incredible.
Well, it just suggests that not only is Indiana's offense explosive, their defense is better than Michigan's going into this, too. You just look at what they're doing to teams. Their defense has got a bunch of non-household names on it, but they've played together for a while. Most of those guys have been at James Madison together. Amari Farrell had 2 interceptions in the game against Michigan State. D'Angelo Pons had 2 picks against Washington the week prior, and one of those was a pick 6. So, it's not just one guy either in the secondary. They're getting enough pressure up front, obviously, with 7 sacks and 15 tackles for a loss. Indiana's running on all cylinders on this one.
No, that Pons guy is all over the field. We've got our hands full, as Steve mentioned. We are heavy underdogs of all places in Bloomington. I'll have a full report at some point next week for you, Steve, about what happened.
Let's talk about the biggest game in the Big Ten last week, Ohio State at Penn State. Man, I think this potentially was just more than Ohio State beating Penn State in this one and staying alive for the Big Ten championship game. I saw Ohio State make a defensive goal line stand, 4 downs inside the 5-yard line, and then with its offense sitting on their own 1, they ran through Penn State's defense to run out the clock. It's the first time that I can recall that Ohio State did something physical with their run game to make a statement since beating Notre Dame 2 years ago in the season opener. Ohio State has something to brag about. I think Ryan Day may have been playing for his job in that game, the way that they celebrated at the end of all of this. And James Franklin has got an 8-game losing streak to Ohio State and can't seem to win big games.
No, I felt like this is one where we're going to get something out of this as Michigan fans. Either Ohio State's going to be an absolute dumpster fire, they're going to go crazy because they've lost their second game, or Franklin's going to blow it again. And, of course, we got Franklin blowing it again, in my opinion. And I don't disagree with anything you said, so credit to Ohio State. But Penn State had 4 chances to score within a couple yards of the end zone, and they ran it 3 times and then called this horribly designed pass play. Either that or it got screwed up by the receivers. They were on a short field vertically. They globbed together 11 guys horizontally in 1/3 of the end zone. Aller tried to throw a pass. It wasn't even close. It was baffling. Cue the production truck right to James Franklin. It made no sense. Show the Penn State fans rolling their eyes. It was baffling, Steve. It was horrible.
And where was Tyler Warren? This is where everybody is going at in terms of the criticism of James Franklin, because a lot of it has to do with how he coaches and how he uses players. 4 times inside the 1-yard line. It was Tyler Warren that went around the end for 33 yards to get to the 3-yard line, and they didn't use him in the 4 plays inside the 5.
Baffling and delightful from my perspective. Just can't stand that guy. And then, as you mentioned, Ohio State just jammed the ball right up their throat to get out of that position. It was bad. Penn State, they are in a bad way. They were undefeated going in. Their best win, Illinois.
Who was at least ranked at the time.
Yeah, and they don't have the benefit of playing the schedule.
Right.
We looked at their schedule as that unique one, and it seemed to almost be a benefit. Now, It's really a question, Steve.
Well, it's a question about maybe where they're seeding. Penn State's going to make the playoff. They have an interesting game with Washington. That may be the most intriguing game of the Big Ten next week because 6 Big Ten teams are on a bye. Nothing too exciting on the horizon. Penn State had a schedule that looked like if they don't lose 2, they should be in. And they hung on to beat USC at USC, which is what everybody does. But their only ranked team at the time, Illinois. Illinois is not going to be ranked during the course of this week. But the one loss, it's going to be enough that's going to get them in. Will it get them a home game? Hard to say.
Yeah, if they win. We'll see. I just think that this one's tough to take for their fan base, for Franklin. A few interesting things around the nation. We had a string of upsets out there, Steve.
Yeah, a string of upsets that cluttered up one conference while helping another. Going into this Saturday, there were 3 ACC teams that could have finished the season undefeated at the end of the regular season. Miami, Clemson, and SMU. And all 3 of those teams wouldn't have played one another at all during the course of the regular season. But when Louisville went on the road to beat Clemson in Death Valley, that cleared things up at least temporarily for the ACC. Miami and SMU are the 2 undefeated teams left. If everything goes naturally the way it's expected to, then it's going to be Miami and SMU for the ACC title, and that will be very smooth. In the SEC now, though, everyone has a loss because Texas A&M not only lost, they got blown out by South Carolina, a team that's 500 in conference play. There are 5 teams in the SEC with 1 loss. That's Texas, Georgia, LSU, A&M, I just mentioned, and Tennessee. When the initial college football rankings come out, how many SEC teams are going to be within shouting distance? Where are they positioned versus the Big Ten? And more importantly for the SEC itself, how do you pick 2 teams out of this group to represent the SEC? They'll do it by tiebreaker. Will everybody endorse that tie-breaking method, however it shakes out? Absolutely not.
Yeah, and guess who's going to be on the front lines of all those questions? None other than Ward Manuel is going to be receiving the questions, the awkward tongue twisters from Reese Davis, who tries to delicately put complicated questions toward the CFP commissioner. Ward Manuel is going to be the guy who's going to have to handle that now, Steve. So we'll see how he does.
At least Ward.
How do you have so-and-so, given that, like all the transitive properties?
Well, at least for Ward's sake, when he's answering the questions, he maybe you wish he could say it, but it's like I was out of the room, so I don't know how they came. I don't know how they came to that. I was asked to leave. I can't be involved. Now he'll be in there for every minute now.
I will say this: there's this talk of well, should the Big Ten and the SEC get guaranteed teams? You only need guaranteed slots if you don't feel like the committee is doing their job or is you know what I mean? If you feel like they deserve slots, you don't need to guarantee them. If you feel like if you're doing a good job. That would be the only reason. If you don't trust the committee to make the right selections and put the best teams in there, but that undermines the whole idea behind the committee in the first place.
Right. Either that or you just need your money grab and further separate the haves from the have-nots, and you just absolutely guarantee it, and you can make up the rules as you go.
Yeah.
But there's been pushback on any plan like that because the media and any Joe Q public fan knows that if you guarantee spots to just 2 conferences, well, then the whole credibility of the playoffs comes under question.
Yeah, I agree. What else, Steve? Anything else from the nation?
LSU is hosting Alabama this week in what should be a playoff elimination game for both of them. For recruiting purposes, I think I want to see LSU lose to Alabama so they can be knocked out. Maybe LSU doesn't look so good to a certain quarterback from Belleville. But that's just wishful thinking. Georgia is at Ole Miss, and based on the way Georgia's played against Florida and against Kentucky, it's an upset alert game. And for Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss, they spent a ton of money on NIL themselves, and they are 1 loss away from likely elimination as well. Georgia is favored by 3.5, but in the ESPN FPI, Ole Miss is favored strongly in the game.
Steve, you have a couple pet teams that you like to keep an eye on. Should we talk about them?
Oh, and the things that only I care about.
Steve's pet teams.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Everybody knows nobody cares.
No one cares.
Nobody cares.
I care.
Then do whatever you want.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
You're making me care about it, Steve,
Here we go.
It's pretty funny.
Nebraska lost to UCLA and their best chance to become bowl eligible this season. Nebraska has lost 3 straight games after starting the year 5-1. They lose to UCLA, considered one of the worst teams in the Big Ten. I have to admit, the Bruins have gotten better over the last few weeks. But for Nebraska, this is a 7-year bowl drought, is the longest in the Power 4 conferences. And guess what Nebraska has left on their schedule? At USC,
Loss.
Wisconsin, at home, and at Iowa.
Loss.
No guarantees in any of that. Dylan Raiola was shaken up at the end of the fourth quarter. Didn't get to play the rest of the game. Don't know about his health for the future. But Nebraska, it'd be so Nebraska of the last 15 years to be sitting at 5-1 and finish the year at 5-7.
Now
and I'm here for it.
We're all watching, Steve.
I am here for it.
All right.
Nebraska fans, I am here for all of it.
All right, follow Steve Clark, Steve Clark02 on Twitter. All right, he's going to be tracking this closely. All right.
Tracking it further than the election coming up on Tuesday.
Oh, my gosh. All right, Steve, is that it?
No,
Are there any other pet teams?
USC loses another fourth quarter lead. They lose 26-21 to Washington. Like Penn State, Greg, they had 4 chances inside the 5-yard line in the fourth quarter, came up empty. Then another shot late as time was running out. They got in the Huskies' red zone. That ended on downs. USC has lost their last 5 road games. That's never happened to the Trojans before. And the USC football team had a fourth quarter lead in all 5 losses this season. They are 4-5. They've got to play Notre Dame. They might not make a bowl. And Lincoln Riley, who was on the hot seat before the season began, may have to learn how to do wall squats because whatever he's sitting on is too scorching to be able to sit on.
Yeah, so who's got it worse than us? These guys do. Steve, thank you on this Schadenfreude moment to close out the podcast. All right.
And just a reminder that Michigan football are the reigning national champions. Go Blue, Greg.
Go Blue.